Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 3 Episode 8 Under the Cloak of War. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. So I have to start with the spoiler warning for Strange New Worlds up to Season 2 Episode 8. If you haven't seen up to this episode, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. So, this episode was a sort of dark, dire war episode. It had like these flashbacks to Mbega and Nurse Chapel and how they met and their backstory in the war, which was alluded to earlier this season in episode 1. So I did appreciate getting that. But I think this episode was pretty by the numbers. It was pretty much stuff we've seen before in fiction. Didn't really offer anything new. Now, the main storyline with the Klingon ambassador, who became an ambassador for the Federation, but was known as this butcher or whatever during the war, and he happened to be at the same location that Baga and Nurse Chapel were at, Dakra, or whatever his name is. That storyline reminded me a lot of some episodes like Duet from Deep Space Nine and Detrell from Voyager. Detrell was kind of emulating Duet, and so it seems like this episode's trying to emulate those episodes. And if that's true, then I'm sorry, it doesn't do a very good job. This episode is not even in the same ballpark as those episodes. And although I do like Detrell, I think it was in my top 20 favorite Voyager episodes, and I do think it's a great episode. Duet, of course, one of my favorite episodes of the entire top 3 of the entire franchise. So I think that episode is nothing short of a masterpiece and one of my favorite pieces of fiction of all time. And so it's a pretty high bar to climb when you're trying to be like that, and I don't think this episode even gets on the railing. It doesn't even get on the first rung of the ladder. So I don't know what the hell my metaphor is about, but anyway. Not that this was a terrible episode, I just think, I don't know, I think it could have been better than it was. I think the way it went was probably not the best direction. So, I'll just jump straight to the big reveal. The big reveal is that Mbaga was, we see in the backstory that Mbaga is, heard about Dakra, General Dakra. He was in control of the Klingon forces on the planet, and that they were killing everyone. They were killing civilians. Their children were dying, and they started killing even their own people, anyone who wasn't a Klingon warrior. So they're killing Klingon civilians as well, and he just thought that they needed to put an end to it. So he went on a mission to kill him. And he didn't manage to kill him, but he killed his highest generals. They refer to them as warlords, or whatever. So I suppose they had their own factions, or whatever, that the Kra was ultimately in charge of. And so he killed the heads of the other factions, which effectively ended the fighting on that planet and crippled them. But the Kra himself got away, and then in the years since then, he was sort of shunned he was kind of ashamed of his cowardice, the fact that he did run away from a fight, which is seen as very un-Klingon, and kind of knew he would be shunned by the Klingons. So he decided to claim credit for killing the other Klingon warlords under his command, saying that he changed his mind and he didn't want the atrocities to continue, and thus he became a Federation ambassador. So he kind of like defected. They even referred to him at the start of this episode as a defector. He defected to the Federation, which of course is always peaceful and wants to welcome enemies with open arms. And he became a strong voice for peace and was preaching peace. But we find out that was all based on a lie, because he took credit for killing those other Klingon warlords when it wasn't in fact him, it was M'Baga. And so M'Baga meets him and they're having dinner, and the Kra has no idea that M'Baga was the guy who actually killed those other Klingon warlords. And so he wants M'Baga to join him in the peace conference as to send a message that even hardened war veterans can make peace on the other side. And when M'Baga reveals this to him and says, "You used blood on my hands to make a name for yourself," and that everything he was saying was based on a lie, but he still wants M'Baga to help him make peace. And he's like, "Look at all I've done since then. Look at all the the peace treaties I've tried to create, and the good I've done to stop the fighting." But they get into an argument, altercation, which is kind of shown through a opaque wall from Nurse Chapel's perspective, so we don't actually see the fighting, which I didn't like. And M'Baga, in that struggle, M'Baga stabs and kills the Kra. And I hated this ending. I thought it was really, I don't know, I think they could have done way more. And by the way, the dagger that he uses is the same one he used to kill the other Klingon warlords. So when they go to examine the dagger, the Chapel in M'Baga lie and say it was Kra's dagger, and they're like, sure enough, oh yeah, it's the same dagger he used to kill the other warlords. But we know it actually wasn't him, it was M'Baga who kept that dagger, and he was warning the Kra to go away because he was contemplating using that dagger to kill him, and when the Kra wouldn't go away, that's what happened. And then later when Pike goes to M'Baga, M'Baga says, oh, it happened just like I said, which we know isn't true, that he was just defending himself, but then admits that he's glad that the Kra is dead. And so it's different than Duet and Jetrel, because in Duet, you find Kira's confronted by this Cardassian war criminal who was responsible for atrocities and killing tons of Bajorans. Well, at first he claims just to be a file clerk, but then she finds out he's actually this huge monster murdering guy, guilty of genocide, and he admits it and he's proud of it. And then later, again, spoilers for Duet if you've never seen it, but you should. Later, Kira finds out that he actually is just a file clerk, and he was lying about being this monster who was responsible for genocide in order to, because he felt so guilty about what his people did, in order to atone for his guilt and to make Cardassia admit their guilt. And that was a very, very, as I said, one of my favorite pieces of fiction of all time. And it was a very powerful episode because it really undermines prejudice and example. Like that episode took Kira's prejudice, how she met a Cardassian, and just because she knew he was there at that particular site where the atrocities took place, is like, he's guilty. All Cardassians are guilty, fuck them all. And then her suspicions were confirmed that he was the biggest monster, and she was like ready to execute him, and then found out that he was actually just a young man who was struck by the guilt and couldn't, and was like completely ashamed of what his people did, and made her re-examine her prejudices, re-examine her bigotry, and realize that not all Cardassians were alike. So that is part of what makes that episode so incredibly powerful. And then you have Detrell, which is more of like an Oppenheimer situation. I haven't seen that movie yet, but I'm going to. Where you had this guy who created a weapon of mass destruction that killed many of Neelix's people during a war, and then they subjugated his people. And so when he comes aboard the ship, Neelix sees him as a monster who's capable of all his atrocities and genocide, and he's trying to apologize to Neelix the whole time. But then Neelix goes through his own personal journey, and he realizes that he is just dealing with his own guilt because he was actually a conscientious objector and was, or could be even referred to as a deserter, and that he was hiding, and that's why he wasn't there on the moon that was destroyed. So he should have actually been killed if it wasn't for the fact that he was a coward, as he puts it. And so he was transferring that anger onto Detrell as a way to sort of not deal with his own personal guilt and shame. And then Detrell, of course, proves how guilty he feels, because we realize the mission he's on is to try to resurrect some of the, or most of the people that he killed, which of course turns out to be a fool's errand and doesn't work, but he's desperate to do it. And then the full weight of all the guilt he's been living with, Neelix finally realizes this and forgives him. So there, even in those two episodes, they're different from each other, Detrell and Duet, because they deal with different things. One is Kira's confronts her own bigotry. Like, she doesn't forgive a war criminal because she realizes this guy isn't actually a war criminal, but how she associated anyone of the same race as being guilty, and she's forced to question that. And Detrell, Neelix does forgive the scientist responsible for creating this weapon of mass destruction, even though he was responsible for genocide, and realizes just the guilt he's been feeling under that weight, and is able to forgive him. And that's what makes it different. That's why, I don't know, I don't kind of like this episode, because this episode here, Under the Cloak of War, M'Baga doesn't forgive him. It's like kind of the opposite, that this guy is preaching peace, and has found peace, and is working for the greater good of both the Federation and Klingon Empire. In fact, he's kind of shunning the Klingon Empire, like Spock tries to give him this Klingon Arachnogeno, and he's like, all Klingon culture sucks, why would you want to study that? So he's kind of rejected all Klingon culture, and is trying to, like, in some ways people could say he's trying to make up for what he did, the atrocities he did, and this episode doesn't really deal with it, which again, this is something I would put as a strike against it, but one could infer that perhaps he also feels really guilty for the atrocities he committed, because they said he was responsible for killing children and civilians and whatnot, even his own people. But you find out that the main thing he's known for in killing his own generals, or whatever, his own warlords, was actually a lie, and that really he was hiding from the fact that he was being a coward, that the Klingons would shun him for being a coward and deserter, so he ran to the Federation because he knew that they would accept him, where the Klingon Empire wouldn't accept the fact that he was a coward, and he ran away from M'Baga, who was killing his generals. And so in that regard, you could say, well, he's a faker. he didn't really have true intentions. He didn't become this great ambassador to create peace. He did it because it was his only option, because he had to hide from the Klingon Empire and pretend to be this butcher, because otherwise they would say he's a coward and just kill him. And so you could say he's deceptive, which was M'Baga's conclusion, that you're benefiting off of the blood from my hands and making claim to it. But really, the guy is working towards creating peace. So does it really matter what he did in the past, or that he's lying about what he did, if the end result is less war, more peace? That means saving lives. Is the end result is good, is saving lives and creating a peace between the Klingon and the Federation, then does it really matter? And the fact that these are complex questions, and the episode, I think, evades them. It doesn't really tackle them in a meaningful way, in my opinion, by he just kills them and stabs them with a knife, and that's the end of that. And then M'Baga says, I'm glad he's dead. And I understand, and I also think the episode does a good job with dealing with PTSD and the horrors of war, and how particularly it affected M'Baga in particular, about how he was saying, because when the Andorian tried to recruit him on the special ops mission to kill the Kra, he declined, but then when he saw that kid he had healed had died, and they heard that the Kra was now killing children and civilians, that it pushed him over the edge, and it took him to a place he never wanted to go, because he declined that mission in the first place, because he says, I don't want to go, become this murderer, that I want to be able to return to my family and be like a decent human being, a decent father, and if I go too far, I might not be able to come back. And so this episode is saying that he kind of did go too far, and being reminded of that specifically just drove him over the edge. And one could forgive him for having that sort of attitude, especially the fact that the Kra was claiming the murders that M'Baga committed for his own, in building his career off of that, and how that would make M'Baga feel. But all that being said, in contrast to Duet or to Trell, our main character, Kira in one case, Neelix in the other, learns something and become a better person, where M'Baga doesn't. He lets his trauma consume him. So one could say it's a darker version than of those other episodes, and that's okay if you want to have a sad ending or a depressing ending, as opposed to, I would still call Jatrell and Duet depressing episodes in their own right, but their endings had rays of hope, I suppose you could say, where this one doesn't really. And I don't know. To me, that doesn't. It's a different choice, and maybe some people would appreciate that, but I don't. To me, it would just be more powerful if M'Baga learned something. If he actually allowed the Kra to keep lying and use his own guilt and trauma, and he had to live with that, because ultimately what the Kra was doing now was saving lives and for the greater good. And so he could, if it was forced to not necessarily forgive him, but to let it go, to me that would be a more interesting character story. Not that I necessarily need a happy ending, but that would actually be a dark ending in its own way, in the same way that Duet and Detrell were also dark endings. But because M'Baga would be still, his trauma he'd be forced to confront it again, and he'd be forced to let it go and face the fact that this dark thing that he did is what's allowing this Klingon to live and thrive, but it's also resulting in saving lives and peace, which is absolutely what they need. And so for me, that's a better ending. It's still dark, but it's not as I don't know, especially the way, I didn't like the way they they had this opaque wall and you couldn't really see the struggle. And when Decraw first died and we showed the knife in him, my first thought was, they're in sickbay. They could save his life, probably. It's just a knife. This is the 23rd century. They could heal a knife stab with their advanced Federation medical technology. They are already in sickbay. So the fact that they didn't even try smelled of plot contrivance to me, because the plot wanted him to die. And the fact that I just disagree with that choice of having him die. It felt kind of empty and hollow. I feel like it would have been more meaningful if M'baga was forced to let him live. That's just my opinion. And then, as I said, I liked some of the war flashbacks. It was interesting getting the perspective of him and Chapel and what they went through in the horrors of war, and I think it was very good of portraying the horrors of war, but it was also kind of cliche, especially when they had that one guy who, Chapel and him saved his life, and then he was immediately like, I want to go off in the special ops mission, and then he gets killed. Like, it happened too fast. I formed no attachment to him, so when they showed that he was dead, I was like, yeah, of course he's dead, because of course they're going to have it, the guy in his life, the little boy's life, not little boy, but young man's life that they saved, he dies, and it's going to drive M'baga over the edge. Like, that was all so very typical of war movies and TV shows, and I didn't find it particularly good writing, if I am being completely honest. So my rating for Under the Cloak of War out of 10, I'm going to give this episode a 6. Good. It was okay. Like I said, I liked the war flashbacks. It was interesting backstory in M'baga. It did properly tackle the horrors of war and present a unique situation, but I think they zigged when they should have zagged. I think they had a really good concept and really good setup, but they didn't really go the right direction with it, and they didn't really make it that interesting, and it's kind of, the ending just fizzles out for me, and it's not as powerful as it could have been. And plus, it was trying to be like Giants, and as I said, it's not even the same ballpark of those other great episodes it was trying to be like. So kind of see this as a failure, but not a totally terrible episode, not a bad episode. It's decent, but it's probably not one I'm going to remember very well or want to rewatch very often. Anyway, that is it for my review of Under the Cloak of War. I will be back to review Strange New Worlds next week, and I'm very, very trepidatious about this episode that's going to be a musical. I saw this meme once saying, there was quoting people saying, Star Trek is doing musicals is un-Star Trek, like Star Trek never done musicals, and it showed a picture of the episode, what's it called? Way to Eden from the original series, as a way to be like, haha, get it? Ha! Star Trek has done musicals before. Yeah, but that episode sucked very badly. I'm very trepidatious and afraid of this episode, not because Star Trek has never done musicals or that Star Trek shouldn't doing musicals is un-Star Trek-like. I'm trepidatious for it because Star Trek doing musicals is dumb, and when they've done it before, it sucked. And so that meme kind of actually proved my point. But anyway, maybe I'll like it. Maybe I'll be surprised. We'll see. I will give it a shot, but I'm very trepidatious about it. Anyway, be sure to check out my channel as I continue to cover Strange New Worlds, as well as I'm covering Star Trek Next Generation, and also covering many other Star Trek videos and many other shows. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.